Yes, I'm going to talk about the lateral exchanges of carbon and greenhouse gases. And I want to start the presentation with an acknowledgement slide. I saw Megan when she was putting her presentation together, and she had done that, and I stole it from her. I thought it was a good idea because this is an extremely collaborative project, and this is actually an underestimate here of the number of people that have contributed to the data that I'm going to be showing you. And partly that's because it's a complex system, and partly it's because of the design of the project. I also want to acknowledge our funding sources. They're the NOAA Science Collaborative that's been mentioned. My program is the USGS Coastal and Marine Geology Program. The USGS Land Carbon Program is also a supporter, and NOAA Hui Sea Grant as well. So first, what do we mean when we say lateral fluxes? What are the sources of this material and the processes that drive it? This is a cross-section here of through a salt marsh with a creek that floods and drains the salt marsh, and here's the platform with the grass growing on it here. And so you can see in this diagram, what happens is you have flooding water. The water interacts with the soil and with the plants, the microorganisms, and as a result, it can either leave behind various forms of carbon, particularly particulate carbon can fall out from solution when the currents slow down within the grasses, and that adds to the soil, the rate at which the soil accretes or increases in elevation over time. And it can pick up detrital carbon, such as dissolved organic carbon, and it can pick up CO2 from respiration of microorganisms and plants. And when that CO2 dissolves, it forms a set of compounds referred to as dissolved inorganic carbon. There are also respiratory products such as methane and nitrous oxide, which can be produced in the soils. And those can dissolve in the water as well and drain either as surface drainage or as pore water drainage from the salt marsh and leave the system and contribute to the budgets of these compounds in the adjoining estuary. So we need to know these numbers if we want to think about the net climate forcing of a particular ecosystem. They're poorly known in terms of what their contribution is to the total budget of carbon and greenhouse gases in the salt marshes. And as Jim showed you, you can think about the sequestration of carbon in the soils as the net ecosystem carbon balance, or NECB. And that's equal to the net ecosystem production that Jim just showed you, minus any methane flux to the atmosphere, which Jim also just talked about, minus the lateral flux. And so if there's net flux of carbon from the system to the estuary, that's a contributing portion of the budget. So there have been studies in the past of the rates of carbon exchange between salt marshes and estuaries. A lot of the past studies, as Lisa talked about earlier, have been focused on the question of, well, what's the role of salt marsh in the food webs of adjoining estuaries? And so there were measurements of particularly detrital carbon export from salt marshes. There's been very little in the way of measurements of dissolved inorganic carbon export because it's not relevant to the food webs. But here we have compiled 14 studies along the US East Coast. These are all the studies that I could find where dissolved organic carbon exports have been quantified. And you can see that it's a very wide spread from almost zero carbon DOC export in units of grams of carbon per meter squared per year to 350 or so, which is twice the rate of carbon storage that Jim showed us a minute ago. So it can be a very large portion of the budget. Part of the reason for this large spread here is methodological difficulties, and I'll be showing you how variable these things are in time, contributing to the difficulty in getting a good number on the flux rate. So in terms of experimental design, our first strategy was to work in small, known wetland basins, meaning if they're small and there's a defined creek draining a portion of the wetland, we can have a hope of quantifying with intensive sampling at the mouth of the creek the fluxes in and the fluxes out of each form of carbon or greenhouse gas over time, and arrive at a rate of exchange per square meter of contributing salt marsh. And that's been a limitation in a lot of the past studies that makes it very difficult to know the rate of export per unit area. And so our first step in doing that is to identify which portion of the salt marsh is drained by this particular creek. And this is based on LIDAR data of elevation within this Sagelot Pond Marsh. And the basin topography indicates that this portion would drain towards this creek here. So it's very small, only has a surface area of 4,000 square meters. So we set up stations at the mouth of this station at the mouth of this creek, and we collected a lot of samples over time. And our strategy was to collect during a single tidal cycle, during the rising tide, and then collect while that same water drains again from the creek. And so we collected as many different kinds of samples as we could think of. We collected in bad weather when it was very cold. This is Adrienne here. I think she's in the audience somewhere, looking very, very happy in this photo. But we also did it in beautiful weather. Sometimes it was better than others. And we did long days so that we could cover full tidal cycles. And here's an example of some of the results from doing these measurements across a tide. So here on the top graph, we have along the x-axis, we have hours across a tidal cycle. And so here we have low tide, we have flooding tide with water coming in, we have high tide in the center here, and then we have a falling tide to low again here. And so you can see salinity, there's a depression of salinity by just a few parts per thousand at the low tides. And that's presumably due to groundwater input. When the sea level is low, there's a greater hydraulic head from the aquifer to the estuary, and so you get some discharge of groundwater. And you can see that the methane, it correlates very well, is anti-correlated with the salinity, so that we have higher methane concentrations at the low tides and lower methane concentration at the high tide. And this makes sense because we know that when there's anaerobic degradation of organic matter, if you have fresh water present, there's a limited sulfate supply, and so you tend to get more methanogenesis. If you have salt water present, you have lots of sulfate available, and you tend to get sulfide reduction instead of methane production. So this correlation here makes sense. On the bottom graph here, we have carbon dioxide on the Y here and pH on the Y over here. And you can see that we have very high CO2 water at low tide at both ends, and the pH is very low. And in the middle, when we're looking at mostly estuarine water, the pH is higher and the CO2 concentration is lower. This also makes sense. I think the interpretation here is that this water draining from the marsh at low tide has interacted with the soils and picked up respiratory products, and therefore has a very high CO2 concentration. And so low tides, we tend to have drainage of pore water, which is high in CO2, it's higher in methane, tends to be higher in dissolved organic carbon as well. And the higher tides, it looks more like estuarine water. We can look a little bit closer at some flux rates and learn a little bit about the more subtle features of the subtidal cycle flux rates. And so here we have on the top graph, we have the same data. We have water flux this time in cubic meters per second. So we have water flooding into the salt marsh and then draining out of the salt marsh here. And here we have methane concentration, and again, it's high at the low tides. We have methane falling during the flooding tide, And then here we have methane flux, which is the product of these two, concentration multiplied by the water discharge. And so the first thing to note is that most of the methane flux occurs near the high tide here when we have maximum water flows. So although we have some kind of spectacular high concentrations of methane and other compounds at the low tides, and those tend to get a lot of attention, the water fluxes are very small at that time, and so our constituent fluxes are small as well. So this highlights a challenge in doing these measurements. The vast majority of our exchanges of the materials occur near the high tide when our differences in concentration between the flood and the ebb are very small. And so this highlights some of the difficulties with getting very accurate measurements of exchange. So some kind of interim conclusions from that portion of the work. The reduced salinity or groundwater influence pore water seems to be the major source for the methane. Wetland pore water with higher salinity seems to be the major source for the carbon dioxide. And the high sensitivity of the flux calculations to the small differences in concentration at the time of major water flux is a limitation to getting accurate measurements. And so what we concluded from this in part is that insufficient frequency of measurements would prevent us from getting accurate budgets over time. So what we concluded is we should use some sensors to try to get more high-frequency data over more extended time to get accurate budgets. And so the strategy here is to deploy some sensors that will collect aspects of water chemistry and water flow. So we can have continuous data on water flux, volumetric units, and we can have continuous data on concentration of the various forms of carbon and greenhouse gases of interest, and therefore we can calculate continuous fluxes over time. This is quite a challenge to do, however. These are some of the sensors that we deployed. This is from the YSI company. It's a sonde with a series of optical sensors, similar unit from a company called Wet Labs. These measure basic water chemistry parameters like salinity and temperature and pH, et cetera. They also have optical sensors that measure parameters like the fluorescence of dissolved organic matter. So some portion of the dissolved organic carbon will fluoresce when it's exposed to the right wavelengths of light. So you can use this fluorescence to measure the fluorescent dissolved organic matter concentration, and that tends to be correlated with the total pool. And this device here is an ADCP that is a very low profile unit that can be deployed at the bottom of a small creek. It's designed for this kind of system. It can make volumetric water flux measurements at high temporal resolution across extended time at very low water levels and with bidirectional flow. So this is just an example of some of the data that we get across a couple of years. We have pretty good coverage with a lot of these parameters. And so with that, we can do a few things. First, we can use the sensor data as context for interpreting the results of our discrete sample analyses. So for instance, here we're trying to examine the sources of dissolved organic carbon that are being exported from the salt marsh. And we're using, this is supposed to say delta C13. I'm not sure what happened there. Wow, okay. Let's see. Okay, so this is concentration of DOC here, and this is delta C13. And, or no, sorry, it's the other way around. Delta C13 here and concentration here. And so what we have here are a series of points where we measure delta C13 of DOC. You can see the vast majority of the points cluster here, and I think this number here might be an 18, and this is a 20 here. So most of the points are falling in this cluster, which looks pretty similar to algal material in terms of its stable isotope signature. It's probably composed of a mixture of algae and salt marsh carbon from the soils and the plants with some terrestrial carbon mixed in. So the terrestrial carbon falls way down here, very clearly separated from the other sources. You can see this one day in June 2013. We had this huge excursion of much higher DOC concentrations and a much lower delta C13 looking like terrestrial plants, like trees. And this point right here happens to coincide with this. It is this point right here, which falls at a trough here in salinity. The blue trace here is salinity over time. And so the interpretation here is that that we had some groundwater discharge in kind of an episodic event at that moment. Okay, thank you. And therefore we had a big pulse of terrestrial carbon. So that helps us to quantify the terrestrial input and separate that out from the salt marsh input. So very briefly, we have water level here over time. I'm going to show some plots over looking at about a 3-week period in July of 2013 as an example. And you can see, again, we have water level, and here we have salinity. And when water level decreases here, we get these depressions in salinity. So we can start to get a handle on how much groundwater discharge there is and how much carbon that carries. So the problem with using the sensors to try to get the continuous data is that, for the most part, they don't directly measure the carbon. So we have to find proxies from the sensor data to help us estimate the concentrations of the carbon. And so what we've done here is produce a multiple linear regression of DOC concentration that's measured in discrete samples versus predicted DOC. And this regression is based on the pH, the temperature, the fluorescence of dissolved organic matter, and the salinity. You can see that our R-square is 0.86, so it's highly predictive. Nice linear relationship. All the parameters are significant. We don't have multicollinearity in this regression, and so this produces a nice way to interpolate within our data set and estimate DOC concentrations over time. And we did something very similar with the DIC, and you can produce this kind of a result. On the bottom here, we have water flux in cubic meters per second for that 3-week period in July. Here we have in the middle, we have DOC concentration. This is predicted from the multiple regression and the sensor data. And then that allows us to calculate a continuous flux. And so this is a new kind of data, and it allows you to look at some really subtle nuances over time in the fluxes of this material. And for example, we have a spring neap tidal cycle here. The neap is here, we have very small fluxes. In the spring tide, we have much bigger fluxes. But note the scale here. This goes all the way to minus 16,000 grams of carbon per meter squared per year as an instantaneous rate. I'll show you that our net rates are a tiny fraction of that. So we're calculating a difference between two very large numbers, a very small difference between them. So briefly, I can show you that here we have a comparison of the different major carbon pools. Dissolved inorganic carbon is much greater than dissolved organic carbon, which is greatly greater than the particulate organic carbon. And here in the green, we have fluxes, instantaneous fluxes of DIC. In red, DOC, and POC is in black, which just falls right along the origin there. So really, we're mostly interested in the DIC and the DOC. And in this system, it's a very low sediment system, and there's very little particulate carbon. So if we look at the fluxes across months and pull together the data from about 2.5 years, we can look at the flux per month of both DIC and DOC. So the blue here is DOC flux from the salt marsh to the estuary in kilograms per day. And the DIC is in purple here. It's estimated in this zone, and here is where we have more reliable data. So clearly the DIC is a huge term here relative to DOC. We have this seasonal signal in which the DOC is at a peak in the late summer when the salt marsh is most productive. The DIC continues to be very high all the way out till December here, which is a little bit surprising. It may indicate that the main source for that is not the plants themselves, but rather the respiration of the soil. So if we look at that across, sum that to an annual rate, We can put it in terms of grams of carbon per meter squared per year. So these are the same units that Jim was reporting in the vertical flux presentation. And so here we have DIC from this study. It's about 800 grams of carbon per meter squared per year. And a small portion of that is from the groundwater. The rest is from the salt marsh. The small amount of DIC literature that exists already has an estimate of less than 200. So we're going to revise that number up by more than a factor of 4. And for DOC in this study, we have a number here that's 160 something. Don't remember exactly the number. 160 something grams of carbon, which happens to be, or no, sorry, it's 120 something, which happens to be exactly the same as the average of the literature data, but that's really coincidence, I would say. And then here from Megan is one of her sequestration rates. So DOC export is about equivalent to sequestration, and sequestration is about 10% of the total budget here for the fate of carbon that's taken up from the atmosphere. So this highlights the need to have an understanding of this term in the budget, because it is the sequestration is just a small portion of the total fluxes. And with that, I'll take any questions.
That was a very interesting talk.
Thanks.
I have a question about the water budget. Because I mean, you pointed out you have like the cycle from neap tide to spring tide.
Yes.
And I would be interested, does like your catchment size change during the spring tide, or is it like overflowing, or how does it look like?
That's a good question. So we went to significant efforts to produce a budget, a water budget. That's really a hard part of doing these measurements, and part of the reason we don't have a lot of good published rates of exchange is because you go to a salt marsh and you do these measurements. Commonly, especially if you go to a larger salt marsh to get a big significant system, commonly the water will flood in through one canal and then it'll drain out of other canals, and you can't close a budget. So that's, as I mentioned, that's part of why we went to a small system. Still, the water fluxes that we measured with the sensor were not a full representation of the water budget. And Neil Ganju, who's one of the participants in this project, ran a hydrodynamic model on the system and quantified, based on the water level data, how much water was flooding our 4,000 square meter basin at each level of tide, and looked at the difference between that water budget and what we measured in the creek. So we have an estimate of what percentage of our total flow with flooding tide and falling tide is occurring through the creek. When the creek overtops, you get sheet flow onto the marsh. Some of that still interacts with our 4,000 square meters. And then when the tide falls, a larger percentage of the water that's sitting on top of our 4,000 square meters drains into the creek than the percentage that drained through the creek as it flooded in the first place. So we use the difference between those using the hydrodynamic model to correct our numbers, which actually revised them down quite a bit. We had much bigger flux numbers, and but when we consider that that a lot of the water falling out of the, or excuse me, a lot of the water that's flooding onto the marsh is not represented in our creek measurements, and therefore is an import of carbon that needs to be subtracted from our export for each tide. So.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We'll just take one more. Oh.
That was fabulous. Thank you, Kevin. So I'm trying to put this in context with Jim's talk, and I thought I saw an export lateral flux term for you about 215, and that bar was like 800, which is fascinating. So the question is, how did I jive?
Don't try to put it in context with it's no, you know, as hard as we tried, the his presentation, my presentation are not quite meshed. And so this 800 grams per square meter per year of DIC is new information to Jim, and will make the budget unbalanced. And I think it's really interesting to think about why that would be. We have this huge export of DIC that's not accounted for as uptake from the atmosphere. And I think the answer to that question is probably that we have several hundred years of stored carbon in this peat, this highly organic peat, and some of it's sequestered long term, some of it's still active biologically, and so we can assume that there's still respiration occurring in that soil. And so a lot of those respiration products, even if the carbon was taken up from the atmosphere last year, 10 years ago, 50 years ago, it can still contribute to the DIC export today.